Welcome back again to our lecture series, which is, at least from my perspective, real fun, for we already had some fantastic talk by Ramberthuser 2 weeks ago and a pretty inspiring discussions afterwards, opening up, I would say, a whole panorama of potential perspectives on the archive. To encourage more of you to participate, please note that we are only recording the talks, not the discussions afterwards. So don't worry, we are not going to archive you on our websites or on the CCSA YouTube channel. Before starting with the program for today, I would like to reconnect at least to some of the issues we discussed after our first talk, such as the archive as an institution, but also as practice, the archive as an authority, stabilizing, preserving, and producing not only objects, but also knowledge. The archive as a powerful metaphor, an island in the sea of life, so to say, with its own reality, but with a great impact on the world outside. A storage providing objects for building canons, memories, and historical narrations, which at the same time is based on forgetting. A facility which can be used, but is also using us in the sense that once we accepted its regulations, we are contributing to the persistence of its regime. The archive, of course, as a metaphor for the solid foundation of our society, but also as a place where we may encounter moments of disorder and untold stories or even blind spots. The archive as an unconscious bias of our thinking, but also as a point of departure for uncovering the very same biases, including racism, discrimination, and oppression. Anyway, I think with the lecture today, we are going to shed some more light on at least some of these issues. But before starting, I would like to briefly introduce our today's guest. And we are very happy that Samuall Burgum accepted our invitation to this lecture series. Samuall is a sociologist from Birmingham City University, where he's lecturing at the School of Social Sciences. In 2018, he published his dissertation thesis entitled Occupying London, Post-Crash Resistance and the Limits of Possibility with Routledge. It is an ethnographic study of the Occupy movement in London, focusing on the use and importance of urban space for the protesters, using participant observation and interviews in order to understand how activists managed and organized their protest in the wake of the financial crisis. And of course, looking at the politics of possibility. And I suppose this is also including DIY archives, that means do-it-yourself archives, as a kind of current counter-reaction to official archives and their authoritarian practices. I first came across Samuall's writings only recently, while preparing this lecture series through an article in the Journal of Urban History, presenting arguments and observations that I found should be part of our discussions here in Frankfurt. As the title is clearly indicating, this is also the basis for Samuall's lecture today, entitled, This City is an Archive, Squatting History and Urban Authority. Dear Samuall, a warm welcome to Frankfurt, at least virtually. We are very much looking forward to your lecture. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Carsten. Fantastic introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I wish I was with you in person. As you mentioned before, maybe this is the new normal, but I'm very, very glad to be here and to enter into discussions with you guys. The series looks great. And thanks also to Jennifer for organising it and putting it all together. As Carsten mentioned, this is an article that I've already published in the Journal of Urban History. This is about thinking about the connections between archival theory and the archival turn and urban studies, and thinking about space, power, authority, and resistance, activism in urban spaces as well. And this kind of comes from my background looking at Occupy London, but also a more recent project where I was looking at squatting in London as well, which is kind of it was a natural move from Occupy. So what I'm going to do today is just start off by thinking about a specific case study. So I currently work at Birmingham City University. Birmingham is a city in the middle of England, and there's a controversial high-speed rail connection being built between Birmingham, and London. And the reason this is controversial is because there's widespread environmental destruction as part of the kind of will to build this high-speed rail link. It's also been very expensive to the public purse, to public money. It's been underpinned by compulsory purchase orders, so people's homes, people's workplaces and public space is all being bought up in order to build this link. And also we know that the ticket price when it does finally open is going to be ridiculously expensive. So most people will not be able to afford to take this high-speed link between Birmingham and London. So the station in Birmingham is being built right outside my office at Birmingham City University, which has been quite interesting to watch over the last few years. And one thing that I've noticed as I walk through Birmingham Centre from the train station to my place of work is that HS2, which is the name of this high-speed rail project, is hell-bent on inserting themselves into history. You see from these pictures here on the boards that surround the building site that there's lots of examples where HS2 have tried to put themselves into Birmingham's timeline. It's as if HS2 was an inevitable step, that there's a history, 2 centuries of rail progress, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, of which HS2 is the inevitable next step. This is going to be the future of railway in Birmingham. And by surrounding the site in this way, by surrounding it with these kind of archaeological and historical narratives, HS2 basically claims a historical authority over the site. It builds itself an archive that inserts itself into space in the middle of Birmingham as a city. And I think this is an example of what we might call archival authority in urban space. These boards are constructions of history which intersect with spaces in order to produce a situated authority over that space. And it's these kind of themes that's led me towards developing an underused idea in urban studies, which is that the city itself is an archive, and what that can bring to our understanding of power, authority and history in urban space. And city spaces kind of embody this authoritative material history, one that's being continually asserted, contested, twisted, and then reasserted again. So it's an idea of history in urban space that is continually being constructed, continually being brought about through examples such as HS2. So the way in which I'm going to structure this presentation is I'm first going to talk about archival theory. It sounds like you've already had discussions around this from the previous talk, but just to recap it and explain how I intend to use it when I then get to the second half of the presentation and thinking about the city itself as an archive. So in the first half, I'm going to talk about the archival turn, which was this kind of deconstruction of archival authority in the like late 80s and mid 90s, but then also a more recent participatory turn and the recent literature in archival studies that's thought about participation of activists, of communities, and how they use archives to bring about their own authority in public spaces. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to take those ideas from the archival and participatory turns to think about urban space itself. How is the city itself an archive? And I'm going to argue that there are 2 things that this lens allows us to do in urban space. The first is it makes us attentive to the dynamics of authority. And the second is it gives us a capacity to aspire. And this is about the connection between archives as history and archives as the future, as future alternatives. So let's start by thinking about the archives in context. Well, traditional archives are sites of civic, national and colonial authority. We might think of record offices, museums, libraries, or even online databases or public timelines, such as the HS2 example. In this way, the classic archive is about its territory. It's about the materiality of that institution. And this is, I think, crucial for understanding how archival authority works, by their very design, their architecture, their geography and their aesthetics, the archive becomes tightly connected to the territory in which it's located, whether that's a city, a nation, or a colony. And this is all about the archive holding superior knowledge, or appearing to hold the objective account of who we are and where we've come from. And we can trace this back to Derrida, who was central in the archival turn. And he kind of went back through the etymology of the word archive to the Greek, which is archi, which means two things at the same time. It's both a place of commencement, so the archi is a place where nature or history begins, but it's also a place of commandment. So it's a place where, according to law, men and gods command, and the authority was exercised in that space. There's a few examples we can think of this kind of archival authority in the classic sense. So in Britain, in 1850, there was a Libraries Act. And the idea behind this was that they were going to build public libraries in cities all across the country. Now, what's interesting about the Act is that Parliament gave money for the buildings, but no money at all for books. And this kind of demonstrates to me that these city archives, these libraries, were all about that authority in that space, representing a institution that was a liberal kind of demonstration of like liberalism in urban space, rather than the actual books and the education itself. We also might think of national archives, things like national museums, national galleries, national archives, national record offices. And there's a way in which this ties to Benedict Anderson's idea of an imagined community, that when we have this storage, this kind of arc of significant objects and significant materials that are worth saving, that connects to our imagined community as a nation, as a national identity. And then there's examples of colonial archives, where records were kept on colonized peoples, people who were oppressed in different parts around the world. And then those record offices were used in order to keep information on the people, in order to control people. And these colonial archives have become really important post-colonization, in order to kind of open them up and allow people access to that history and that information. We can think about the Truth and Reconciliation committees in different countries, such as South Africa, Canada, and the way in which that's tied to Indigenous histories, and the way in which they use those previously closed off archives in order to kind of re-find those national identities. But all across these different examples, what archives have is this kind of authority. They're a privileged site, a space for storage, for cataloguing, for preserving, for retrieving, and for interpreting data. And they kind of create this epistemological credibility off the back of that. Someone is deciding what goes in, someone is deciding how it's catalogued, someone's deciding what is preserved and what is thrown away, and then what is retrieved and how it's interpreted. These are all moments in which the archive is constructed. So rather than a purely objective account of history, the archive is this construction of history. It's a narrative of history. And this right to interpret claimed by the archives implies that some knowledges are being granted some recognition. So some knowledges are being considered legitimate and therefore need to be included in the archive and preserved, whilst other knowledges are silenced or excluded because they're considered irrelevant or illegitimate histories. So the archival turn is all about deconstructing that authority, thinking about the silences and the biases that are built into that supposedly objective account of history that's stored in the archive. But of course, the archive itself is a site for particular kinds of knowledge and styles of reasoning. And in this way, Osborne argues that the archive is more of a status. It grants a certain right to speak to some people whilst denying that to others. And at the forefront of the archival turn in the 90s was the argument that archives can't deliver objective accounts of history and space, because they operate more like institutions that bestow that objectivity onto objects through their very selection. In other words, it's the discriminatory gaze of the archive which grants that privileged status to certain documents and the refusal of that status to others. And therefore the archive is not a piece of data, but a status. This is Mbembe's argument. However, whilst that archival term is really important to understand how authority and power is wrapped up in these historical knowledges, more recently what we've seen in our archival studies is a participatory term. And this can be described as looking at activism, so looking at different social movements, looking at marginalized communities, particularly kind of indigenous communities, and how they can use archives and archival authority to prevent a kind of counter-narrative. But because in the archival turn, archives were seen as this kind of oppressive institution, a lot of the participatory turn has been described as this anti-authority. But I argue that actually this is to miss something. We should see archives always as an example of authority, but it's where that authority is coming from. Is it coming from the margins? Is it coming from groups that are oppressed? Or is it coming from more dominant state, city, colonial institutions? So this is a way, this participatory turn is a way of thinking about archives in a way in which they can strategically intervene into these dominant discourses. They can claim an authority and people can claim a right to represent themselves through a community archive, through a kind of activist archive. And in this way, the activist archive becomes a space of empowerment, of self-determination, as well as a kind of more collective and participatory form of knowledge production when compared to those more mainstream institutions. So I'm going to give you a few examples now of this kind of activist archive and this participatory turn, and really think about how authority plays a role in these kinds of groups, and how also there's limitations and problems with these kinds of archives. So this is a group called the Resistance Archive, or the Resistance Project, that I did some work with in London. And their slogan is "Be part of the future, learn from the past." So the idea here is that they invite activists to come and archive their own storage of materials, whether that's leaflets, photos, zines, posters, all sorts of stuff, and come to a place in London, Bishopsgate Institute, and archive these objects, put them on an online archive that people can then use. And in this way, this kind of gives a participatory authority to the people who take part in that archive. It becomes a living archive that is always ongoing. It's a never completed project. So people come to these sessions, these workshops, and they learn how to add their own labels, how to catalogue their own materials and apply significance to their own objects. And in this way, it becomes a more kind of participatory, democratic example of an archive. Rather than someone else deciding what is important and what isn't, this is open to all kinds of materials that people themselves deem to be significant and a part of this history. So in this way, the archive creates a connection between the past, the present, and the future. And I really love this quote from Robertson, that the archive provides an authoritative basis of who we are, where we come from, and where we are going. And that we is really important. This is about creating a collective identity that can draw from the past, even if that's alternative histories that aren't being represented in dominant archival institutions, where we've come from, who we are, and then where we're going in the future. So again, it comes back to that slogan that the Resistance Archive use: be part of the future, learn from the past. By reclaiming these radical histories, projects like the Resistance Project are able to draw from those narratives and give themselves authority for protests in the future. And a lot of the people who were involved in this were at COP26 in Glasgow. They were part of the protests there, and they were part of the kind of ongoing resistance and activism that's taking place in the UK today. So they're drawing from these histories in order to have that counter authority. On the flip side, however, these kind of activist archives have inherent challenges which are important to recognise. And one of the keys here is trying to maintain a location when this archive is inherently precarious, it's inherently under threat. So activist and community archives have a tendency to be somewhat fragile, and this makes it uniquely difficult for them to maintain a territory, to maintain a location where they can build that counter authority. As I mentioned before, territory is central to understanding the authority of the archive. Yet many of these activist archives are located in dilapidated buildings, perhaps ex-squats with poor resources, meaning they're always under threat of destruction and always under threat of kind of being lost or damaged or destroyed, which if you compare that to the more mainstream archive institutions, they have more technologies of preservation. So they have more kind of ways of keeping hold of this history. The example in the picture there is from the Advisory Service for Squatters. And they're located above an anarchist bookshop in Whitechapel High Street in London. They have in the attic there a fantastic archive of squatters' movements in London, but also across the UK and Europe. But the history of the Advisory Service for Squatters demonstrates what I'm talking about here, this inherent precarity of these kinds of counter archives. In a previous premises, the Advisory Service for Squatters was attacked by a right-wing group and the building was burnt to the ground. And they lost a lot of their archives in that arson attack. And in their current offices, where I spent a day kind of going through their archives, leafing through everything, the roof is leaking, and there's also a melted red telephone on the side, which was rescued from that fire at the previous premises. And this kind of keeps in mind a continuous reminder of how precarious these archives can be. And I found this folder, which was stacked on top of everything else. I don't know if you can quite read it, but it says, amazing relics, absolutely fascinating, unique and irreplaceable stuff. If the place catches fire, please take this. And this in itself just demonstrates how precarious these archives can be, how fragile they are. And within this, if we interpret this, it's around a political tension, right? It's between that political tension between location and control that the archives have inherent within them. And particularly the tension here is around the desire to keep archives situated, to keep them within a community where they might be more accessible so people can participate more, but also they're symbolic. They can be mobilized as part of territorial counter-narratives. So there's an archive in South London, again in an ex-squat in Southwark, and this archive was mobilized as part of recent protests against the demolition of social housing in that borough. And I think that the importance, the reason that it was mobilized as part of those protests is because it was accessible and it was there. It was symbolically located in the middle of that location, so people could actually use it as a resource as part of their current protests. Okay, so that's the first half of the lecture, thinking about the archival turn. Some of the stuff we're probably familiar, also going over this idea of the participatory turn. The main point that I want to take from that first half is that archives are all about authority, yes, but this isn't just an authority that's dominant. This isn't just an authority that is oppressive. Archives also have an authority that can be more participatory, an authority from the margins, if you like, from the grassroots, from marginalized communities, from activist movements, that they can use this authority as a counter narrative in urban spaces. So what I'm going to do now is start to think these ideas through in terms of urban space, start to think about this idea of the city itself as an archive. So moving away from these traditional ideas of the city being, of the archive being rows of documents or digital repositories, I want to think about buildings, streets, squares, monuments as archives themselves. And I want to think about how these dynamics of authority interact within those urban spaces. As Carsten mentioned at the beginning, I did some work with Occupy London coming up to 10 years ago now. And part of the work that I did with this, which is in my book on Occupy London, is about this idea of authority in space. By occupying public spaces in the post-crash moment, Occupy London were claiming authority over that space. They sought to intervene in wider post-crash discourses, that we needed to bail out the banks, that inequality was okay, that the inequality between the 1% and the 99% was justified. By occupying public spaces, especially the one that they did in London, which was outside the stock exchange, they tried to intervene in that history through a physical appearance. So those dominant narratives, those dominant kind of, in this example, neoliberal and capitalist narratives, were contested through that very occupation in space. And yet, similarly to the activist archives I was just talking about, Occupy London was also really precarious. They struggled to maintain their location in the space. You know, the weather turned on them, the police turned on them, the state turned on them. When they lost their legal battle, they were just evicted. So much like those activist archives that seek those kind of authoritative counterclaims, Occupy was also in a precarious, fragile position that was eventually pushed out of the public space. So when I started my more recent project on squatting, I also wanted to think about these connections between authoritative narratives and histories and those authoritative counter narratives and how they might operate in urban spaces. So this is the kind of dual character, double character of the city as an archive. On the one hand, just like a colonial or city or national archive, the city structures specific notions around prospects, capabilities, and rights of certain groups. So you might think in a UK context of these different monuments in different cities of slave owners, of people who got rich off colonialism, and how those statues in urban spaces create a dominant narrative of British history, of who we are, where we've come from, how we've got to be a rich nation. It was from the exploitation of people around the world. But it kind of, the idea that these monuments stayed standing for so long suggests that this wasn't a problem, that this was something, perhaps the empire was something that the British were proud of, or part of their kind of national inheritance and their national identity. And more recently, during the pandemic, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was talking about Blitz spirit. So going back to kind of World War II, drawing on these historical narratives of British pride, British patriotism, and how he kind of used that to kind of, I don't know, create a national identity during the pandemic, create a kind of national response to that, mobilize that archive in that way. And in this way, we can see how the city is an archive because it shapes understandings of the urban past. And therefore, it also shapes understandings of an urban future as well. That idea of this is who we are, this is where we've come from, and this is where we're going. But the flip side to this, just like that participatory turn that I was talking about earlier, is that the city is also a participatory archive. And we can use this lens in order to intervene into the concrete structures and these sedimented histories of the city. What I'm arguing is that seeing the city as an archive makes urban space contingent, it makes it flexible, it makes it malleable, plastic. You know, these layers of sedimented, silenced histories can be suddenly drawn upon and act as counter sources of authority. I think one example of this kind of participation is the fact that people are now pulling down these statues of people who got rich from colonialism and got rich from the slave trade. And really, this is about building forms of urban living and rich sediment, and drawing on these rich sedimented histories to create new imaginations, to shift the conditions of possibility in urban space. So I'm going to just give you a few examples of this. So I think walking through a city with a squatter activist, is to see the city in this way, is to see the city as an archive. You know, buildings and streets and squares become remembered and recollected as traces of past contestations, past protests and past occupations. So urban space becomes more than what it seems. It becomes malleable and selective. The histories that are overlaid in urban space become kind of contingent. And this allows new kind of portals of entry, repetition, circling and crossing through all these different historical layers in urban space. And in particular, like in reference to squatting, vacant buildings, streets, demolition sites, they all become re-enchanted through this kind of archival lens. And I think this unsettles those dominant urban imaginaries. It unsettles those dominant discourses in urban space, because it's to see the city in a different way, through a different lens, through a different history. And what's interesting about squatters in particular is when you're walking with them through a city and they're talking about all these historical events that they were part of, is they're always on the lookout for the next building, the next opportunity. And this kind of turns that city as an archive, draws from it in order to think about future protests, future counter movements, counter narratives. So here's a more specific example of what I'm talking about here. When I was at the archive, the Squatter Archive in London, I came across this map. And this is from a group called the Remembering Olive Collective, the ROC, who were a grassroots archiving group from Brixton in South London. They described themselves as a group of women who want to find out more about Olive Morris and celebrate her life and legacy, collecting an oral history from those who remember Olive Morris, researching and creating an archive and a website, as well as this walking map that you see there. So this is a project built around the squatter, activist and Black Panther Olive Morris. What it reveals through this kind of archival history is a remarkable narrative about Morris herself, but also Brixton and South London, that kind of challenges the way in which we might see London spaces today. Brixton historically has been an area of high immigration, a large kind of Afro-Caribbean community, but today it's becoming increasingly gentrified, increasingly white, and people are being pushed out of the area who've historically lived there. So through this kind of history of this activist Olive Morris, we kind of see Brixton in a different way. Let me just give you a bit of history about her. So she was born in Jamaica in 1952, and she later moved to London to join her parents who had come over for work. She became politically conscious at an early age, dropped out of school and joined the British Black Panthers in order to fight discrimination against Black people in housing, employment and the criminal justice system. As a young single woman, Olive Morris wasn't eligible for social housing. So in the early 1970s, she began squatting, including the building that you see in the centre of the slide there, which is 121 Railton Road. This was the first squat in a private building in Brixton in 1972. And one of the famous events of squatting history in London was depicted on the Squatter's Handbook you see in the bottom left there, where Olive Morris returned to their squat in January 1973 to find that the police were there. So she climbed up on the roof, waited for the police to go, and then re-squatted the building. And this was kind of a symbolic event in the 1970s squatting movement in London. But what's interesting about 121 Railton Road is it has become a kind of brick and mortar entry into the city archive of Brixton. This was a squat that Olive Morris established in 1972, but it wasn't evicted until 1999. That is a really long-lasting squat in the British context. And this is a building that went on to play a central role in the spatial politics of Brixton and London. After Morris left, it became a bookshop, which provided a hub for Black struggles in South London against the police, as well as a headquarters for different movements, such as the Black Workers Movement, Black People Against State Harassment, and other quite big movements of the time. In 1981, the squat then became the 121 Centre and home to wider campaigns than the Black movement. So Brixton Squatters Aid were based there, as well as Food Not Bombs, which was a peace movement, community resistance against the poll tax, anarchist Black Cross, and the direct action movement, as well as various film cooperatives, libraries, and a printing press in the basement. So when I found this map and I headed down Railton Road, today you would not guess that it had any of this history. It's been highly gentrified. As you can see, the 121 Centre in the bottom there is now a house. like there's no kind of trace in the streets of this history. But using the archive, using this walking map, I suddenly could become attentive to these narratives, to these sedimented histories in this space. And I started to see the street very differently. You start to see it as a space of possibility. You start to see it as a space where perhaps these histories could be drawn upon again for the future. And as I was walking down the streets, each building becomes a kind of palimpsest. It kind of belies its current appearance, and it speaks to an alternative memory of this space and therefore an alternative future. And you become more attentive to the kind of details of the space. So for example, as I was walking down the path, someone had spray painted on the floor where the panthers roared as a reference back to the Black Panthers at the time. This is something that I perhaps would have missed before and just not been attentive to at all. But instead, I recognized it because I was using this archival lens through the walking map. So I could see the histories of the space in a different way. So a way to describe this, and I think this is a beautiful phrase from Appigiori in 2003, is that the archive gives us a capacity to aspire. So in contrast to state archives and those kind of more dominant institutions, these activist and community archives that are more participatory are characterized by a presence of voice, agency, and debate, rather than just reading, reception, and interpolation. And in this way, these participatory archives, such as the Remembering Olive Collective, become a negotiation between memory and desire. I really love that as a phrase. It's a memory that we're drawing from in order to desire an alternative future and alternative possibilities. And I quite like this from Steedman as well, in this book that she wrote about dust, archival dust. The archive is a place of dreams. Within the archive, there's a politics of imagination, and the past becomes a place of succor and strength, a home for the ideas that people possess of who they really want to be, who they desire to be going forwards. So we think about the streets of Brixton, drawing upon those alternative histories. Communities in that space could use those narratives to resist against gentrification, resist against displacement in that area of South London. So to conclude, I see the city as an archive as giving us a lens in two different senses. On the one hand, it makes us more attentive to the dynamics of power, history, and authority within urban space. The buildings, the streets, the architecture, street furniture, monuments, and archival institutions themselves become reframed as not the objective history of a city, but just part of the multiple record of that city, one that we encounter in different ways, even if some of those records are more clearly visible than others. So the first thing the city's archive gives us is it makes us more attentive to the way in which authority and history intertwine in urban spaces. The second thing that I think this lens gives us, and this is really important, is it gives us an authority to aspire. It gives us a capacity to aspire for different futures. It intervenes in more dominant discourses in urban space. And in this way, archives can be treated as anchors in the reconstitution of social relations in the city. The archive is a new city coming into being. The city can be read as an archive in which urban political struggles can be repositioned in a zone of anticipation of a city yet to come, a city that's emerging in that space. In other words, the authority of the archive is double. It's both a top-down thing, but also a bottom-up thing that allows us to actually intervene into urban fabrics, to recreate them, to imagine them to be different. So I just wanted to flag at the end of the presentation where I'm going with this idea. So I mentioned before the statues that are being pulled down in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, but also in the USA, actually. There's a big anti-statue movement from Black Lives Matter against slave owners and Confederate statues over there. The example you can see in the pictures was a slave owner statue that was in a public square in Bristol in the south of England. And you can see on the left, that's what the statue originally looked like. And in 2020, Black Lives Matter UK pulled it down and threw it in the river. The picture in the middle, I don't know if you can quite see it, was a, I'll try and make it bigger for you, 2 seconds. So this is a statue of a Black Lives Matter protester that an artist put onto that plinth after the Colston statue was pulled down. This didn't last. Bristol City Council took this down very quickly, but it raises a question of what happens with these monuments. So in these moments of intervention, these moments of participation, what happens with these public monuments? Do we replace them? Do we leave them as empty? Do we just kind of ignore it? This image, which came afterwards, is the layout of a slave ship, which was put in front of the empty plinth of Edward Colston and the Black Lives Matter statue. Now, this is an image which in the UK context is front and centre of the education we get about the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. So this has resonance, this is symbolic, and it kind of puts that history into that space. It challenges it, it intervenes into it. This is an alternative archive, if you like, that's been placed in front of that statue to contest that space. And the idea that a slave owner should have a statue in the middle of a major public city. But today, the plinth is empty, and Edward Colston, the statue that was pulled down, was fished out of the river and is now in a museum. So this raises some questions that I'm now looking at with some colleagues and the paper that I'm developing around what is signified by an empty plinth. Should it be replaced with anything? There's parallels here with the buildings in Belgrade that were bombed by NATO in 1999, but are still ruins, still kind of open ruins in the city. And in a way, they become these kind of symbolic empty archives, these archives of destruction that kind of feed into the identity of people in Belgrade today and Serbia. And there's a kind of way in which those archives are challenged, but also play out again and repeatedly play out going forwards. There's also a question here of what happens to the statue itself. So it's been contested, it's been pulled down, been thrown in the river, then what do you do? And there's parallels here with Confederate statues in the USA. So the statues that have been removed of slave owners in the USA are being put into special parks. We can also see parallels with communist statues in Eastern Europe, such as the park outside Budapest, where they just took all the statues from the city and just put it in a place. And it's kind of a question there of what that archive then symbolises. How does that go forwards? What is the relation between that archive and the future? You've removed it from public space, but you've still stored it somewhere. What does that mean? And finally, there's a wider question here of the role of public art and monuments as archives, as collective identities. In a Nietzschean sense, what are the different historical discourses that are mobilized around these statues and these monuments? So is this antiquarian? So we need to protect, the argument is we need to protect the statues just because they're old and therefore they're part of history, they need to be protected. Is it a monumental history? In other words, we have to protect it because it's important. Actually, in practice, I think the antiquarian and monumental arguments cross over a lot. People say, oh, it's old, we need to rescue it. Well, it's like, okay, what's the significance of it being old? Oh, because it's important. Right, okay, so the antiquarian and monumental histories do overlap quite a lot in that argument that we need to protect these statues. Or of course, there's the third Nietzschean type of history, critical history. Pull the statue down, topple it, throw it away. And I think these kind of types of history allow us to understand the contestations over these statues as archives in public spaces. So this is the kind of stuff that we're looking for in this article we're writing at the moment. So that's the end of the presentation. Thanks so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think of the paper. There are the references in the bottom right there, but also, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is published with the Journal of Urban History. So please, if you're interested, give it a read. Please drop me an email if you want to chat about any of it. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.